I woke up at 18 with the taste of blood memory still sharp in my mouth, and the knowledge that silence had once almost killed me. My name is Eliza Rowan, and in another life I had learned that poverty was not the worst enemy humiliation was. The classroom smelled of dust and chalk, the ceiling fan rattled like it might fall, and laughter slid across my skin with practiced cruelty. I lowered my head, pretending to sleep, because sleep had always been safer than reacting. In this school, rumors were traded like currency, and I had once been the cheapest coin. A dare, a few bills, a whispered challenge that was all it took to brand a girl for years. Back then I had followed the wrong person, trusted the wrong smile, and paid for it with my name. This time, I watched the same setup unfold with the calm of someone who had already survived the ending. Hunger clawed at my stomach, a familiar reminder of the house I returned to every night. My stepmother rationed affection and food with the same precision, always generous in public and exacting in private. My father avoided conflict the way children avoid storms, by closing his eyes and hoping it would pass. I learned early that asking for help only made the debt larger. The boy who approached me after class thought he was in control. He always did. Confidence born from money and indulgence made him careless. He assumed I was still the girl who would trade dignity for survival. I agreed to follow him, not because I was tempted, but because I wanted the leverage that came from letting him believe he had won. We ate first. I chose the cheapest meal and finished it slowly, memorizing the way irritation crept into his eyes. Power hates being delayed. What he never considered was that desperation sharpens strategy. I arranged witnesses, evidence, and exits long before he realized the rules had changed. When the trap closed, it was quiet, efficient, and irreversible. He lost money, reputation, and the illusion that consequences could be avoided. The following days were chaos for him, and clarity for me. Whispers turned, eyes followed, and the laughter that once chased me learned a new direction. I focused on exams, on distance, on the calendar counting down to my escape. At home, the pressure intensified. My stepmother searched for proof of rebellion, my stepsister sharpened her mockery, and my father stood between us like a wall made of paper. They accused, suspected, and controlled, believing obedience could be squeezed back into me. I stopped shrinking. I documented everything: hunger, bruises, insults, missing money. Each detail became a line in a record that refused to be erased. School became my refuge and my battlefield. I slept less, studied more, and treated the final exam as a contract with my future. No emotion, no revenge, only results. When violence finally reached for me, it failed. Fear no longer froze my limbs. Preparation guided them. The truth surfaced, ugly and undeniable, dragging its architects into the light. Adults argued about reputation, while I argued for my life. Compromise was offered, forgiveness demanded, silence encouraged. I refused them all. I left home before dawn with one bag, and no intention of returning. Dorm rooms were cramped, strangers unkind, but freedom was worth every inconvenience. For the first time, my effort belonged to me. The exam ended under a summer sky that felt too bright for everything I had endured. When the results arrived, my name sat where no one expected it. Achievement did not heal the past, but it severed its hold. Years passed. I worked, studied, failed, learned, and rose again. Success came slowly, built from endurance rather than miracles. Sometimes memories returned uninvited, sharp as broken glass. I let them pass. They no longer defined me. I learned that survival is not passive. It is an active refusal to be consumed by other people's choices. At 18, I chose myself. That decision echoed through every year that followed. The second time around, I stopped pretending I didn't see the pattern. The dare had a rhythm. A boy with money, a hallway audience, a private room, and a punchline that would travel faster than truth. In my first life, I had tried to protect myself with politeness, and politeness had been treated as permission. So I built a different kind of protection, one that didn't rely on anyone's sympathy. I chose seats, where the camera angles were clean. I practiced my own calm face in the bathroom mirror, not to look pretty, but to look unshakable. I wrote a list in the back of my notebook, what they wanted me to do, what I would actually do, and what I would need to prove it later. Every time the ceiling fan clattered and laughter rose behind me, I reminded myself that panic was a luxury I could not afford, but preparation was something I could create. When he approached after class, He carried his confidence like a weapon that had never misfired. He spoke softly, as if secrecy made him kind. He offered a favor, then a shortcut, and finally a plan that was supposed to make me grateful. I agreed with the same careful tone I used when I was counting change at the corner store. Attentive, non-committal, alive. I suggested a public place first. He rolled his eyes, annoyed that I was slow. I suggested food. He agreed, because he thought hunger would make me pliable. At the counter, I ordered the cheapest meal and ate it slowly, letting him stew in the small torture of delay. Power hates being slowed, and impatience makes people sloppy. I used that sloppiness. While he checked his phone, I sent 2 messages. One to a classmate who owed me a quiet favor, and one to a teacher's aide who always hovered near the office. Then I positioned my bag where it would be seen, my exit where it could not be blocked, and my hands where they would remain visible. The trap he planned depended on silence afterward, the kind of silence that comes from shame, from fear, from believing nobody will listen. I refused to give him that. I did not threaten him with violence. Violence would have made me the story. I threatened him with documentation. I guided him to the place he chose, because it was the place where his friends expected results, and expectation makes witnesses. I made sure the doorway was busy. I made sure the timestamp on my phone was on screen. I made sure my voice stayed level when I asked him to repeat what he wanted from me. Then I let him talk. People who think they are untouchable confess without realizing it. He named the bet. He named the money. He named the reason he believed my dignity could be purchased. I didn't interrupt. I collected. When he reached for my wrist, I stepped back, raised my voice just enough, and said the words that change a room. Don't touch me. The hallway went still. A few heads turned. The joke failed to land, and in that pause, the entire script cracked. Afterward, I didn't celebrate. I moved. I walked straight to the office, not trembling, not apologizing, and filed a report while my memory was still sharp. I wrote facts, not feelings. Time, location, names, witnesses. I requested that any security footage be preserved. I asked for the policy that applied to harassment and coercion. The staff tried to soothe me with vague promises. I asked for their promises in writing. When they suggested I should go home and rest, I said I would rest after they opened a case number. Adults argue about reputation when they don't want to argue about harm, and I refused to let reputation be used as a blanket that smothered the truth. By the end of the day, the rumor had changed direction. It didn't die, rumors rarely do, but it was no longer only about me. It was about the boy who had been caught with his hand in the mechanism. School became a place of strange weather. Some students avoided me as if truth were contagious. Others watched with the hungry curiosity people reserve for disasters that didn't happen to them. The ones who had laughed the loudest pretended they hadn't. The boy's friends tried to turn the story into a misunderstanding, then a flirtation, then a mutually messy situation. I did not debate their versions. I kept returning to my version, written down, time-stamped, corroborated. Each time someone tried to blur it, I sharpened it again. I learned that clarity is a form of self-defense. So is consistency. I kept studying, not as an escape but as a strategy. Exams didn't care about gossip. Scores didn't care about social hierarchies. Every hour I spent working problems was an hour spent building a future that could not be bargained away in a hallway. At home, the backlash arrived dressed as discipline. My stepmother watched me too closely, as if my spine had become an insult. She counted pantry items the way she counted my mistakes. If a bruise appeared, she would invent an accident before I could speak. My stepsister mimicked the school whispers at the dinner table, smiling like she was performing for an invisible crowd. My father looked away. His avoidance was not cruelty, but it functioned like cruelty, because it left me alone in a house that treated silence as obedience. So I changed what silence meant. I kept a record. I photographed what could be photographed. I wrote down what could not. Missing cash, harsh words, threats made under breath. I stored copies outside the house. I memorized emergency numbers. I learned which neighbors had porch lights that stayed on late. I wasn't waiting for someone to rescue me anymore. I was building the path that would let me leave and stay gone. Preparation became its own kind of peace. I created routines with the precision of someone assembling a lock. Wake before dawn. Water first. 10 minutes of review. Timed practice. Error log. Breakfast if I could get it. Protein if I could hide it. When my stepmother tried to sabotage my study time with chores, I did the chores fast and returned to my desk without arguing. Arguing was what she wanted. Arguments are hooks. I refused the hook. I studied at school, at the library, in the corner of the gym bleachers if I had to. When anxiety surged, I treated it like a signal instead of a command. I would breathe, check my notes, and keep moving. That was the difference between my first life and this one. Before, fear had been a cage. Now it was an alarm I could respond to. The final exam season felt like walking toward daylight with weights on my ankles. The boys' family tried to lean on the school quietly. My stepmother tried to lean on me loudly. Both expected me to fold. Instead, I became boring. I became the kind of person who answers questions with documents and deadlines. When compromise was suggested, I asked who would be protected by that compromise. When forgiveness was demanded, I asked why accountability was optional. I did not need anyone to love me. I needed the system to follow its own rules. And when the system wavered, I reminded it that external eyes exist: district offices, scholarship boards, auditors, journalists. The same people who loved secrecy, feared paperwork. Paperwork is slow, but it is relentless. Leaving home did not feel dramatic. It felt logistical. One bag, copies of records, a small stack of cash I had saved in a book nobody touched, a bus ticket purchased with hands that did not shake. I walked out before dawn, because dawn is when the world is quiet enough to hear your own resolve. Dorm rooms were cramped and smelled like detergent and strangers' lives, but the door could lock, and that lock was a miracle I didn't have to pray for. I learned how to exist without bracing for footsteps. I learned how to eat without bargaining. I learned how to accept kindness without confusing it for ownership. Freedom was not comfort at first. It was simply the absence of constant threat, and that absence gave my mind room to grow. In the years that followed, I built my life with the patience of someone stacking bricks one at a time. I worked, studied, and kept my boundaries plain. If someone tried to buy my compliance with gifts, I declined. If someone tried to turn my past into a story they could trade for attention, I corrected them once and walked away. Sometimes the old humiliation tried to return, sharp and automatic. I met it with evidence. The grades, the acceptance letters, the pay stubs, the quiet mornings where nobody yelled my name like a warning. I learned to seek allies who respected my autonomy, not my suffering. I learned that resilience is not a personality trait, it is a practice. When I failed, I logged the failure and tried again. When I succeeded, I didn't mythologize it. I treated it as proof that effort, directed well, changes outcomes. I still remember the girl I used to be, the one who believed she was the cheapest coin in a room full of bidders. I do not shame her. She did what she could with what she had. But I don't live by her rules anymore. I live by mine. I speak when silence is requested for other people's comfort. I write things down when someone says, "Trust me." I ask for policy when someone offers a favor. I keep moving forward, collecting skills, allies, and proof of my own resilience. The world did not soften, but I hardened where it mattered and stayed flexible where it did not. Each step away from the past rewrote the meaning of my name, Par. There were ordinary battles that never make it into anyone's highlight reel. Registering for classes when I had never been taught how paperwork works, calling financial aid offices, and learning to repeat my request without apologizing. Sitting in a counselor's chair the first time and realizing I did not have to earn permission to feel tired. Learning how to budget, how to cook in a shared kitchen without guarding every ingredient, how to say no without writing an essay to justify it. Learning that friendship can be slow, built from small consistencies rather than grand rescues. When I started tutoring younger students, who reminded me of my old self, I did not sell them hope as a fantasy. I taught them systems. How to break a problem down, how to track errors, how to protect their work from sabotage, and how to ask for help in ways that leave a paper trail. I didn't tell them the world was fair. I showed them how to survive an unfair world with their dignity intact. That, more than any ranking, felt like turning the trap around, taking what was meant to shrink me and using it to widen the path for someone else. On the rare days I visited my hometown, the streets looked smaller, as if my leaving had changed the scale. People who once watched me with pity watched me with confusion, because pity is comfortable and change is not. My father's eyes carried regret he did not know how to speak aloud. I did not punish him with speeches. I kept our conversations practical and brief, because my healing did not require his confession. My stepmother tried, Once, to make a joke about my phase, I answered with a neutral smile and left. The old version of me would have stayed, hoping to be understood. The new version understood enough. Some rooms will always demand your smaller self, and the only winning move is to walk out. People assume revenge is loud, but what I built was quiet infrastructure. I mapped the school the way you map a city when you have to walk it alone at night. The bright corridors, the blind corners, the offices with glass windows, the stairwells that echo. I learned which teachers believed in procedure, and which ones believed in keeping the peace. The peacekeepers were dangerous, because they would trade a student's safety for a day without paperwork, so I fed them nothing but facts. I never gave them my tears. I never gave them a messy sentence they could misquote. I gave them dates and times and the calm certainty that I would not disappear if they tried to wait me out. The boys' circle responded the way privileged circles always respond. First denial, then dilution, then reversal. They tried to reduce the bet to a joke, to rebrand coercion as flirting, to paint me as ambitious, dramatic, difficult. I listened as if I were collecting weather data, their phrases repeated in different mouths, proof that the story was being coordinated. When someone asked me whether I had led him on, I asked them to define led on in front of the same witnesses who had heard him describe the money. They didn't like definitions. Definitions strip away fog. Fog is where they hide. One afternoon, the guidance counselor called me in and offered a soft smile that felt like a towel placed over a fire. She said she understood how stressful senior year could be and suggested I should focus on my studies instead of drama. I told her I was focusing on my studies and that the best way to support my education was to stop a harassment campaign before it interfered with my exam eligibility. Then I asked her, politely, to put her recommendation in writing. Her smile froze. She asked why. I said because important advice should be documented. That was the moment she realized I was not asking for comfort. I was building a record. She changed her tone after that. People respect you differently when they sense you are not alone on the page. The vice principal wanted to handle it internally, which in our school meant quietly. He suggested a mediation session, as if coercion were a misunderstanding between equals. I asked whether mediations were standard for extortion attempts. He frowned, because naming things correctly forces adults to either act or admit they won't. I told him I would attend any meeting as long as it was recorded, as long as minutes were taken, and as long as outcomes were documented with signatures. He said recordings weren't necessary. I said then the meeting wasn't necessary either. We sat there in a long silence, while his authority searched for a loophole. In the end, he agreed to documentation, because he wanted the problem to vanish, and paperwork was the only price I would accept. At home, I kept my file in a place my stepmother never looked, inside a stack of old textbooks she considered worthless. She searched my drawers for contraband confidence, and I let her. Every search taught me what she feared. She feared independence more than disobedience, because disobedience can be punished, but independence leaves. She started withholding small things, bus fare, toiletries, dinner portions, testing whether I would beg. I didn't beg. I took extra shifts when I could. I traded tutoring for meals. I learned the sharp mathematics of scarcity and used it to plan instead of panic. In my first life, scarcity had humiliated me. In this one, it trained me. My father's silence used to feel like an empty chair at a table where decisions were made. Now I treated it as a predictable variable. He would avoid confrontation until confronted by consequences, so I moved the consequences closer. I left a printed copy of scholarship deadlines on the kitchen counter. I left a note about dorm deposits. I left the list of required documents for emancipation tucked into the mail. He saw them, and he looked at me as if I were speaking a new language. I didn't explain myself with anger. I explained with logistics. He could ignore my feelings, but he could not ignore a deadline. The week before mock exams, the boy tried again, this time with honey instead of heat. He approached me outside the cafeteria and said he had always respected me. I almost laughed, but laughter is an invitation for people like him. He offered to make things easier: notes, a recommendation, a ride home, anything that would make my life feel indebted. I told him I didn't accept favors from people who had tried to buy my humiliation. He stepped closer, voice low, and warned me that I was making a powerful family angry. I lifted my phone and asked him to repeat that warning clearly. He backed away as if the air had turned sharp. Threats want darkness. I carried light in my pocket. Studying became my safest ritual, because it was the one place where effort translated cleanly into outcome. I built an error log with categories: careless, concept, time pressure, panic. Every mistake earned a correction written out in full, because rushing is how shame reproduces itself. When classmates asked how I improved so quickly, I gave them the truth that sounds boring until it works. Repetition with reflection. Most people want a secret. I offered them a schedule. Some rolled their eyes. Some tried it for a week and quit. The ones who stayed became my quiet allies, not because we were friends at first, but because shared discipline builds respect. Par on the day the disciplinary panel convened, the hallway outside the office felt colder than usual. I wore my plainest clothes, because I didn't want anything about me to be read as a performance. The boy arrived with his mother and a lawyer's confident posture, the kind that assumes the room will rearrange itself around their comfort. He avoided my eyes. That avoidance was the first real consequence he'd ever tasted. Inside, the panel asked questions that sounded neutral, but carried bias. So I answered with the same neutrality, and let the bias hang in the air by itself. When they asked why I hadn't just said no, I said I had, on video, and I slid the timestamp forward. When they asked whether I had misinterpreted, I pointed to his own words about money and audience. At the end, the decision did not feel like justice. It felt like the system realizing it could not safely protect him anymore. They didn't announce his punishment to the whole school. Institutions rarely confess, but his access shrank. His friends stopped laughing as loudly. Teachers watched him differently. He became cautious in the way people become cautious after touching a hot stove. For me, the result was less dramatic but more important. The air changed. I could walk through a corridor without feeling the story chasing me. The humiliation that had once stuck to my skin like tar began to dry and crack. It didn't disappear, but it lost its grip, and that was enough to keep going. My stepmother reacted to the school's shift with suspicion, because she understood status like hunger. She asked too many questions about why teachers suddenly greeted me. She inspected my notebooks, searching for proof that someone else was carrying me. When she couldn't find it, she tried to invent it, accusing me of being manipulative, ungrateful, theatrical. I let her throw words until she ran out. Then I asked her for the one thing she couldn't offer: written allegations. She hated that. She wanted my shame, not my structure. That night, after she slammed the kitchen cabinet doors like punctuation, I went to my room and studied anyway. Nothing disarms a bully faster than realizing their storm cannot change your schedule. The closer I got to graduation, the more my life looked like a chain of small contracts. Applications, test registrations, scholarship essays, financial aid forms. I learned to read every line, because I had learned how often people hide traps in fine print. When I needed signatures, I asked early and followed up in writing. When a teacher offered help, I asked for the office hour time and confirmed it by email. When I met with administrators, I requested meeting notes afterward. This was not paranoia. It was survival upgraded into professionalism. The world pretends documentation is cold, but documentation kept me alive. The night before the final exam, my father knocked on my door softly, as if he were afraid of waking a truth he couldn't handle. He said he heard people talking about me at work and didn't know what to believe. I told him to believe what he could verify. I showed him my study plan, my scholarship emails, my list of dorm costs. He stared at the paper like it was a map to a country he had never visited. He didn't apologize. He didn't promise to change. He simply said, "You've grown up fast." And for a second his voice sounded like grief. I nodded, because it was true. I had grown up fast because childhood is a luxury our house could not afford. During the exam, I felt the old fear try to rise. Fear of being judged, of being laughed at, of being found out. I watched it like a wave, and waited for it to pass. Then I did the work, question by question, line by line. In the margins I wrote tiny reminders. Breathe, check units, don't rush. When time pressure tightened, I did not sprint blindly. I prioritized. A good score is not magic. It is choosing what matters and refusing to waste energy on panic. When I put my pencil down, the room looked the same, but something inside me had shifted into place. Results day is usually loud with celebration, but for me it was quiet, because quiet was how I protected what mattered. When my name appeared where it did, a few students gasped, and then the whispers began, searching for a story that made my success less threatening. I let them search. Their stories could not change the number printed beside my name. My stepmother tried to smile that evening. The kind of smile that barters. She said, "We can finally be proud," as if pride were a gift she could offer after years of withholding basic care. I told her my pride wasn't available for trade. Then I went back to packing, because the future I had earned was already waiting. The first semester away was not romantic. It was paperwork, laundry, and learning which bus routes ran late. It was roommates who played music too loudly, and professors who assumed we all started at the same line. I learned to ask questions even when my voice shook, because confusion does not disappear when you hide it. I joined study groups, not for friendship, but for structure. Slowly, friendship grew anyway, the way plants grow when the environment stops poisoning the soil. I discovered that most people weren't plotting my humiliation. They were simply busy surviving their own lives. That realization was a relief so big it made me dizzy. I also learned that freedom can feel like grief. There were nights I lay awake waiting for the next attack, and the absence of it felt wrong, like a missing tooth your tongue keeps touching. So I built new habits. Walking the campus at sunrise, calling a support hotline when memories got loud, keeping my door locked and my calendar clear before exams. I sought counseling, and the counselor didn't ask for a neat narrative. She asked what I needed now. That question, simple as it was, rewired something in me. Need was not weakness. Need was information. I could meet my own needs without begging for permission. Years later, people who only knew the headline version of my life asked how I stayed strong. I told them the truth. I wasn't born strong. I became competent. Competence is the kind of strength you can practice. I practiced it in how I handled money, how I chose work environments, how I signed leases, how I walked away from anyone who treated my boundaries as a challenge. I practiced it in the way I helped younger students file complaints, apply for scholarships, and document what adults wanted them to forget. I practiced it in the way I stopped turning pain into entertainment for other people. Humiliation had once been the trap. Competence was how I turned it inside out. Every so often I think about the boy who assumed I was easy to break. I don't imagine grand punishments for him anymore. I imagine him older, trying to tell his own story in a way that keeps him innocent. Maybe he succeeded. Maybe he didn't. Either way, my life stopped being the stage for his lessons. That is what winning looked like for me. Not domination, but exit. Not applause, but distance. Not the fantasy of a softened world, but the reality of a self I could not be forced to abandon. If you asked me what changed, I would not point to luck or destiny. I would point to the moment I stopped negotiating with people who benefited from my smallness. I stopped explaining my boundaries like they were requests. I stopped treating cruelty as something I could solve by being more agreeable. I stopped confusing endurance with obedience. In practical terms, I learned to keep copies, to ask for names, to record dates, to use email instead of hallway promises. I learned that institutions protect themselves first, so you have to make your safety part of their self-interest. I learned that money is loud, but paper is persistent. And I learned that the easiest way to break a trap is to refuse the role it assigns you. They wanted me to be the embarrassed girl. I became the prepared one. They wanted a scandal. I handed them a case file. They wanted silence. I gave them a timestamp. Long before I learned the word humiliation, I learned the sensation of it. The heat behind the ears when someone laughs and you realize you are the reason. In my neighborhood, being poor meant being visible in the wrong ways. It meant worn shoes that squeaked in quiet rooms, lunches that smelled different, excuses that piled up like unpaid bills. I learned to make myself smaller so I wouldn't attract attention, because attention often arrived with a price tag I couldn't pay. At home, my stepmother treated generosity like a performance for neighbors, then turned the spotlight off the moment the door closed. She was skilled at punishment that left no obvious marks. Withholding, humiliating jokes, chores designed to interrupt sleep, sudden rules that changed the second I followed them. My stepsister learned that cruelty earns approval, so she practiced it the way other girls practiced makeup. My father loved peace more than he loved truth, and he told himself that not choosing sides was kindness. It wasn't. It was abandonment in a polite voice. In the first timeline, I made the mistake of believing that if I endured quietly, people would eventually feel guilty and stop. I believed that being good would protect me. I believed that humiliation had a limit. It didn't. It simply escalated, because my silence taught them I would carry the consequences alone. That year, the dare became a story, and the story became a label. Teachers sighed at me like I was trouble. Classmates used my name as punctuation. Every laugh made me doubt my own memory, because humiliation is designed to rewrite your sense of reality. I survived, technically, but I did not live. And when the consequences reached home, my stepmother didn't protect me. She punished me for the attention, as if I had invited the storm on purpose. That is why the second time I woke up with blood memory in my mouth, I made one decision that carried all the others. No more private suffering. I didn't mean I would shout my pain to strangers. I meant I would stop letting other people define the record. I turned my life into something that could be verified. I bought a cheap notebook and wrote the same headings on every page: date, time, location, witness, what was said, what was done. I stored photos in a folder with backups. I learned how to email myself copies so they lived outside my house. When a teacher said something important, I followed up with a short message, just confirming what we discussed today. I did not treat these habits as dramatic. I treated them as basic hygiene for a life that had been contaminated by other people's lies. The best part about building evidence is that it changes you while you build it. You start to think in sequences instead of spirals. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you ask, "What is the pattern, and what is the next move?" That mindset is not cold, it is protective. It kept me from wasting energy on trying to be understood by people who were invested in misunderstanding me. It also helped me notice allies I had overlooked in my first life, quiet students who hated bullies but didn't know how to intervene, teachers who cared but needed a clear prompt, staff members who were tired of watching rich families bend rules. I didn't ask these allies to fight my war for me. I asked them to do small, specific things: to witness, to confirm, to sign, to forward an email. Small specificity is how you build a case without burning yourself out. After the initial incident, the school tried to move on, because schools love narratives where problems resolve themselves. But the boys' friends kept testing boundaries, and each test became another entry in my log. They tried to bait me into yelling so they could call me unstable. I answered with short sentences and walked away. They tried to corner me in a stairwell. I stepped into the nearest classroom and asked a teacher a question about homework, loud enough for everyone to hear. They tried to mock my clothes. I said nothing, because my clothes were not the subject. When they tried to claim I was obsessed with attention, I asked them why they were spending so much energy chasing mine. The teacher nearby raised an eyebrow. The friends laughed too loudly. The power balance shifted a millimeter at a time. The most dangerous part of a humiliation campaign is that it wants to isolate you. It tells you no one will believe you, so you stop reaching out. I countered isolation with routine contact. I checked in with one teacher every week, brief and factual. I visited the office after any incident and asked for it to be noted. I joined a study group, not because I trusted people immediately, but because being seen as a student with goals makes it harder to reduce you to a joke. When someone offered sympathy in private but stayed silent in public, I didn't shame them. I asked whether they would be willing to be a witness if needed. Most people can't be heroes, but many can be witnesses, and witnesses matter. Scholarship interviews were another arena where my past tried to follow me. Panelists asked about adversity with the tidy hunger of people who want an inspirational story. I refused to perform pain for them. I spoke about responsibility, time management, and the specific strategies I used to improve my scores. When they pressed for drama, I redirected to outcomes: grades, projects, tutoring hours, leadership roles in academic clubs. I learned that you can acknowledge hardship without turning it into entertainment. The scholarship I received wasn't charity. It was an investment, and I treated it like one by showing up and doing the work. Even after I left home, my stepmother tried to reach through distance. She sent messages that mixed sweetness with threat, as if she were seasoning control. She told relatives that I was ungrateful. She hinted that I was unstable. At first, the old panic rose: what if everyone believes her? But then I remembered something I had learned the hard way. You cannot out-argue someone who is committed to lying. So I didn't argue. I built a life that contradicted her story. I paid my bills. I kept my grades up. I worked campus jobs. I collected references from supervisors who had watched me show up consistently. Reality is slow, but it is durable. Over time, it outlasts gossip. There were setbacks. I failed a midterm once because I underestimated how much sleep mattered. I cried in a bathroom stall. embarrassed that I still had tears like a kid. Then I went back to my room and changed my schedule instead of my self-worth. I learned to cook cheap meals that didn't wreck my energy. I learned to say, "I can't take that on," when someone tried to hand me their chaos. I learned that growth is not a straight line. It is a series of adjustments made by someone who refuses to quit. That refusal, repeated enough times, becomes a personality people call strong. When I eventually started working, I recognized the same dynamics in different uniforms. There were managers who used ambiguity to control people, coworkers who tested boundaries with jokes, clients who assumed politeness meant permission. I didn't handle these situations with rage. I handled them with the same tools I learned in school: clarity, documentation, and exit routes. I followed up meetings with written summaries. I kept copies of agreements. I asked for expectations in measurable terms. If someone tried to corner me into a compromise that harmed me, I asked for time to review and returned with questions they couldn't answer. I stopped being impressed by confidence. Confidence is cheap. Accountability costs more, and I learned to value what costs more. The strangest gift of turning the trap around was learning to trust my own perception again. Humiliation teaches you to doubt yourself. It trains you to ask other people what you are allowed to feel. I retrained myself in small ways, naming my emotions without judgment, noticing physical signals before they became crises, believing my memory when it told me something was wrong. This wasn't inspirational. It was maintenance, like cleaning a wound so it can close. I didn't need to erase the past to move forward. I needed to stop letting it dictate my reactions. Sometimes people asked whether I forgave them, the boy, the school, my family, as if forgiveness were a receipt that proved moral health. I learned to separate forgiveness from access. I could release myself from constant anger without reopening the door to people who had already shown what they would do with my vulnerability. I didn't need revenge fantasies anymore. I needed predictability. Predictability is what trauma steals, and predictability is what I rebuilt. Safe routines, chosen relationships, stable income, and a home where silence meant rest instead of fear. If that sounds small, it's because people who have always been safe underestimate the value of ordinary safety. On my best days, I used my story as a tool rather than a wound. I volunteered with programs that taught students their rights and how to report misconduct without being swallowed by bureaucracy. I showed them how to write statements that stick to facts, how to request copies of policies, how to keep messages and screenshots organized. I told them that adults might try to shame them into quietness, and that quietness is not the same thing as peace. I didn't tell them the system would always do the right thing. I told them how to make it harder for the system to do the wrong thing. There is a moment in every life when you realize you have become the adult you once searched for. For me, it happened when a younger student sat across from me, hands shaking, and asked, "What if they ruin my name?" I answered with steady certainty, because I had learned it in practice. Names can be dragged, but they can also be rebuilt through action that accumulates. I taught her to document, to seek witnesses, to escalate strategically, to protect her grades and opportunities while the storm tried to distract her. I watched her posture change as she understood she was not powerless. That change is what humiliation fears most, someone who stops shrinking. I used to think healing was a sudden sunrise,